You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's Friday night. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com for those of you who aren't already there listening. And you can go over and listen to the whole schedule, or at least check it out, over at Odyssey Radio and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. You can also join this broadcast in its simulcast over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And I want to thank you all for being here tonight. And I'm going to say right off the bat, this is going to be a heavier show for a Friday. You'd think Friday would be a little lighthearted, because that's the end of our work weeks. It's the end of our busyness, and hopefully, and we get the weekend off to do other things. But it's a tougher show for me only from one perspective, and that is that this is stuff I am still sounding out for myself, still working out for myself. To say I don't understand it would be a misnomer. I understand it, but to make sure that I can understand it enough to dispense information about it is where I get a little concerned with my own delivery, perhaps. And so, we've been talking about all of this stuff about Christianity, paganism, what do you believe, why do you believe what you believe, all of these things, examining the history of Christianity, examining mostly the history of literalist Christianity, which I want to say that I believe any literalist religion is dangerous. It's dangerous, it's damaging, and it does no good for us. You can look at literalist theology down through the ages and see all the disaster, all the turmoil, all the atrocity, near genocide that it has created. I mean, when you start looking at the early church, and you look at all the persecutions, all the attempts to wipe out those who did not believe as they believed, all through the Dark Ages, the Inquisitions, the Spanish Inquisition, was almost synonymous with terror. And this was all done in the name of the love of Christ. And even coming out of that was the persecution of the Jews and the pogroms down through the ages that had church sanction, or at the very least Christian stamps of approval on them, because these were the people that killed Jesus. And so all this literalist history, and by the way, that led all the way up into the Third Reich, and the Nazi regime in World War II in Germany, and the wiping out of Jews, the wiping out of the gypsy, the wiping out of other people, of other undesirables. This all had its basis in a literal history of Christianity. And we've seen this go on to today. We've seen it in other religions. We've seen it in Islam. And you've seen the literalist religion and how it wreaks havoc on those who do not believe in its literacy or its literalness. And so all of this has led me to really start thinking about, because we talk about it so much over the past few weeks, about Gnosticism and the Gnostic mysteries and what that's all about. And so I approach this with a little bit of, a lot of humility, to see if I can get an idea across. And if I'm wrong, go ahead and tell me where you believe I'm wrong. Let's discuss it. Or if I'm wrong, slap me down. If I'm right, or at least partially right, let's see where this takes us. And so I want us to look at this right now, this whole idea of, I called it life is but a dream. And what I'm reminded of right away, if you're a Star Trek fan, I'm reminded of, in Star Trek, was it 5? I'm trying to remember what the subtitle of it was. not the Undiscovered Country, the one before that. So Kirk, Spock, and McCoy are all out camping. It's like they're out on leave and they've taken a break and they've gone to, they're not in space right now, so they're camping at Yosemite, I think it was. And the subject of row, row, row your boat comes up around the campfire. And row, row, row your boat gently down the stream. Merrily, 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 life is but a dream. And at one point, Spock interjects with his pure logic, life is not a dream. And they go about a fun yet frustrating little conversation about that. So that comes to mind when I talk about life is but a dream. But think about even the words of that song. Row your boat down the stream. Merrily, merrily, life is but a dream. And so I want to talk about this. What is this whole dream thing, and how does it relate to Gnosticism? The awakening from a dream. History is a dream from which I'm trying to awake. James Joyce said that in his book Ulysses. And after many years of studying the great religions of the world, you have to develop an almost allergic reaction to the downright messy gobbledygook that's contained in all the supposedly sacred texts of the religions around the world. And our studies here that we've been doing for the last few weeks have forced us to conclude that these books can't possibly be the sole word of God. And in fact, if it were God's lawyers were present, we would advise suing for misrepresentation and defamation of character of God by most of the religious works about God in the varying religions around the world throughout history. But does this conclusion render these texts completely worthless? No, of course not. After all, we accept that the words of Plato and sometimes Rumi or Shakespeare or Jesus, whoever, are just the words of men, but we consider them sublime for all of that. We're not saying for a moment that the Tanakh, the New Testament, the Quran don't contain moments of beauty, insight, and wisdom. Even the Apostle Paul, who I believe hijacked Christianity, that even he has words of wisdom and beauty in the things that he's written in the New Testament. It's just that we can't, and we don't dare ignore the dreadful passages of intolerance, of bigotry, of hatred that they also contain in those scriptures. We can no longer go on pretending that religious terrorists are perverting the true message of their sacred texts, when the texts themselves create us an us versus them type of scenario in our world. That's what those texts do, and they incite their readers to divinely sanctioned violence. We've seen this over and over again. Let me take a sip of coffee, and I only announce that I'm doing that for the pause that will be created in the audio version of this radio broadcast. Hold on a second. It's still very hot, so I'm glad I didn't gulp. Now, the problem is that literalist religions expect their followers to accept their sacred scriptures on an all-or-nothing basis. Despite this, of course, most believers cherry-pick the passages they like, and they simply ignore the ones they don't like. This goes on all the time. We see people who claim that they are biblical literalists, and yet they allow women to teach in the church, and so on, and things like that, when the New Testament says they're not supposed to. So this is the kind of thing we cherry pick, and don't get me wrong, I'm grateful that this exists, this cherry picking, because if Jews and Christians and Muslims were to carry out what their scriptures demand in the average modern city, there would be absolute anarchy. And so how long will this era of tolerance last? In our reading of history, every culture has its equivalent of the Taliban, waiting in the wings, dreaming of a return to absolute power and plotting their theocratic coup. You look at America alone. Now, the religious right in America, as it's so called, is sometimes very admirable in some of the things they stand on. And on the surface, people would say, well, they're just a biblical organization. They want to have a government that flows along with their spiritual beliefs. Innately, there's not a whole lot wrong with that, with saying, I'd like a government that follows in what I believe. Well, you can't always control that, and just for the record, if you want to have a theocracy in this country, you're going to end up with a regime, as you see in some of the Muslim-driven governments that exist out there in the Middle East. You're going to have you do not want the religious right having a foothold in this country beyond merely being an organization that might want to sway the minds of people, or and what I mean on that is by moral or religious or spiritual stance. You do not want them in your government. You want to have them free of government, because the last thing we want in this country is a theocracy, a government by the rule of one religion. And this is what, of course, the founders fought against and stood against when they wrote the Constitution the way they did. You can recognize God, you can respect Him, you can recognize certain religions, but you cannot govern under those precepts. And so we have to apply our God-given gift of discrimination to all scriptures. We have to recognize that they're so internally riven with illogicality. It's a word I don't use often in this form, illogicality, and inconsistency, that they've made us mad. We're stupid. For example, in the Gospels, Jesus said, "He who is not against me is for me." But he also says, "He who is not for me is against me." And so the first is egalitarian and inclusive. The second is narrow-minded and exclusive. They're mutually contradictory. So believing both makes Jesus kind of a nutcase, and ourselves a bit schizophrenic, if we believe that. So I'm not saying that there are not some inspiring passages in the New Testament. The commandment to love one's enemies is immensely profound. Does it make this teaching any less profound if Jesus didn't actually say it? Or maybe, what if, as some people say, he didn't even exist? Which I happen to believe he did, and that he was transformed into what we see in literalist history. But, of course not. There was never a Hamlet. There was never a King Lear or a Prospero. But we still love Shakespeare. His insights into the human condition will be relevant as long as there are human beings, as will those that someone put into the mouth of their hero, Jesus. I believe Jesus was a real guy, but I believe that there was a lot attributed to him, edited into the texts about him, falsified in texts about him, that is simply not true. Now, during our lifetime, the wisdom of the world has become available at the local bookstore, on television. It can be downloaded from the internet in a heartbeat, unless you have my internet out here in the country, which is slow. And surely it wouldn't be absurd to continue confining ourselves to one tradition or to one sacred text. Of course, unless you believe that that text is the truth. When you believe that, you're entering into the dangers of what we've been talking about for weeks in this literalist history. Is there more than just one way to view? Remember the way this whole thing started? I started asking the question, is Christianity compatible with paganism? Christo-paganism. Remember how far back that was and how we got to where we are now? So, the first half of Plato's Timaeus is a fascinating insight into the cosmology and the mysticism of Greek esoteric tradition. But the second half is quite frankly laughable, because anyone with a modicum of knowledge or modern knowledge about human anatomy and physiology is going to realize that Plato was simply wrong in the things he put forward. Likewise, the Bible might contain great wisdom, but unaccountability, given its supposed omniscience, it has nothing to say about quantum physics. Any book is merely a product of its time and its place, and I think the same is true with most of the biblical scriptures, that they are a product of their time and their place, their context, the people to whom it was being written, the people who wrote that stuff, and the traditions of their culture, and so on. There's also many excellent books out there, and it's plain madness to remain fixated in one text. My opinion, books like Upanishads, the Tao Ching, the Crest Jewel of Wisdom, are books that can offer so much more than the Bible can by way of philosophy. And if these are too Eastern for you, then just look at the ancient philosophers such as Plato and Plotinus. Check out sublime poetry of the Sufis, such as Rumi and Hafiz. Dip into the transcendental wisdoms of medieval Christian mystic Miser Eckhart. And if these are too old or too foreign, try Walt Whitman's poetry, his ecstatic poetry, or T.S. Eliot's Four Quartets. These two authors are much more mystical than either Moses or Mohammed were. But whatever you choose as your source of inspiration, remember, it's only a book. It's only a writing. And that includes the book that we know of as the Bible. It's collected writings about superstitions. Pardon me as I dip down here. It's cold here. It's very cold here today, and I have my heater on, and it's a little too close to my feet, and I'm starting to burn up down there. So pardon that little life interlude. The modern world offers you and me so many sources of inspiration to choose from that it's created what is often dismissed as a spiritual supermarket. But what's wrong with supermarkets? When we're kids, there were only religious corner shops offering a limited choice of dusty products that were well past their sell-by date. And now we can pick up and choose the spirituality we prefer. We can say like this, but we don't want that. We like this, we don't want that. We got the internet. We can go anywhere we want and download anything we want, buy anything we want, read anything we want. And that's pretty fantastic, but let's celebrate it. That's a gigantic step forward from the days when the church ran a monopoly on the truth. It no longer has that. And so what we have to really start doing is start recovering from religious insanity. Okay, hear me out on this. The world has moved on, but literalist religion is stuck in the past. And unlike just about every other aspect of human culture, where new is sexy and old is outdated, in matters of religion, old is holy and new is heretical. Muhammad expressed this backward-looking attitude perfectly when he announced this. He said, "Beware of new things, for every new thing is an innovation, and every innovation is a mistake." That's from one of your great literalist historians, religious historians in the world. So the very nature of life is that things constantly change. But literalists don't like change. Things were better in the good old days when religion dominated our lives. We need to go back to how things were in Muhammad's time. And we need to go back to the days of the early church. We've fallen from a primordial paradise, and we're heading for the terrible punishment we deserve. The future we're offered is Armageddon, mass destruction, divine retribution, fire and brimstone. And these really are these really the images we want to be filling our heads with, our children's heads with? Is it all about a fear theology? You can tell when a spiritual tradition has succumbed to literalism because it stops changing. It stops evolving. People repeat the same old creeds, perform the same old rituals, they wear the same old costumes, and although they no longer really have any idea why. They can give you pet answers, but they couldn't. It was like when I talked about asking my youth group, why do you believe why are you here? Why are you a Christian? And I got some of the silliest answers. Oh, well, because my parents are Christians. That doesn't make you a Christian. Isn't being a Christian a followership? You're following someone? That's why I used to tell them I could stand in my garage for a week and I'll never become a car. So coming to church doesn't make you a Christian. The Hasids began as a vibrant movement of Jewish mystics. They were free thinkers in the 18th century Poland. But a few centuries later, they've become a literalist cult, to be seen performing their devotions at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, still wearing 18th century Polish dress designed for Eastern European chill, despite the fact that they now live in the burning heat of the Middle East. So literalists cling to whatever gave them their identity in the past, no matter how mad it might be. Religion is obviously crazy, folks. You know that, I know that, we all know that. Yet, for some reason, there's this feeling that we should respectfully avoid criticizing this craziness because it's a matter of faith. So why? Why should we do that? Why don't we feel compelled to show this sort of unquestioning deference in matters of politics, science, or anything else? The time has come to announce that the emperor is wearing no clothes. Literalist religion deserves to be ridiculed, not respected. It's irrational. It's immoral. It's outmoded, and it's historically funny. Hysterically funny, too. Religious literalism is a bad idea poorly thought through. Christian literalists, for example, proclaim their opposition to paganism, yet they celebrate Easter, which is named after the pagan goddess Easter, Eostre, E-O-S-T-R-E, which is named after that pagan goddess. And they don't celebrate this most important of festivals on a fixed date, which marks the crucifixion of Jesus, but according to a pagan lunar calendar. Even more absurdly, they mark this holy day by eating eggs, a symbol of the pagan goddess. Why don't we have chocolate crucifixes? Could you imagine that? After all, Christianity is about eating the body of Christ. So, although it might be a bit of a problem deciding which end to start on, literalism is idiocy. If we told you that a friend of ours had been born of a virgin, could walk on water, and had come back from the dead, who but the truly demented would believe us? Yet billions happily believe this based on a bizarre old book. And if we were dealing with anything other than religious belief, such irrationality would be grounds for the diagnosis of mental illness. Think of that. If you took it out of a religious context, what would you have left? So, religious madness causes seemingly intelligent people to turn the truth inside out to fit their dogmas. Folks, we'll be back in 2 minutes. We got more to cover. Stay tuned. right, folks, welcome back to the show. Thanks for sitting here through the break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And you find that at odysy1.com. Let me take a sip of coffee. Coffee. And you can also go find this show broadcast in simulcast form in video over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Let's kind of jump right back into this because I left off left you hanging a little bit, even though there was a little bit more to what I wanted to say. I'm talking about literalism being complete idiocy. And we see it in just the way we do things. We were talking about Easter, which we have coming up now. Easter based on an old pagan goddess. The eating of eggs, of chocolate Easter bunnies, of chocolate eggs, and all of that stuff. But never would you find Easter, which is supposed to be the celebration of the crucifixion, the brutal murder, execution of Jesus, the Son of God, the burial, the resurrection. But we celebrate it with Easter bunnies and jelly beans and chocolate eggs. Unless we have finally, in some senses, separated the two out, the holiday from the celebration. And so, while we do this celebrating, we also don't eat, cream-filled chocolate crucifixes. There you go. You can see how crazy some of this is. So in literalist theology, literalist history, it's kind of idiocy. And we were talking about it. If I told you that a friend of mine was virgin born, could walk on water, could heal the sick, and raise the dead, you'd think I was nuts. And so religious madness causes seemingly intelligent people to turn the truth inside out to fit their dogmas. Look at Crown Prince Abdullah, a member of the despotic ruling aristocracy in Saudi Arabia, and an Islamic literalist. He recently announced this is a few years ago, but he said, Saudi Arabia has a constitution inspired by Allah and not drawn up by man. I do not believe that there is any Arab who believes that the Quran contains a single loophole which would permit an injustice to be done. If there is any truly democratic system in the world, it is the one that is now existing in Saudi Arabia. So, let me get this straight. Democracy is not about the will of the people, but about following divine revelation and being ruled by a king. That's a new one to me for a description of democracy, definition. It's hard to know where to begin with someone who's willing to distort the meanings of words such as democracy to such an extent in order to justify his religious prejudices and vested self-interest. But it's not just mad Muslims who don't seem to recognize the obviousness of their own hypocrisy. The majority of American Christian fundamentalists who worship the Lord and look forward to the kingdom of heaven are supporters of the Republican Party, most of them. Not all of them. Don't be offended if you're Christian and you're not. That's for the most part. You see the supporting of the Republican Party. Woo! Pardon me. Wow, no sneeze button. Holy cow. That just hit me out of nowhere. So isn't republicanism, if you will, in the United States about abolishing kings and lords? That's where the base of the word comes from. Irony, confusion, willful self-deception becomes so entangled that it's difficult to see where one begins and the other one ends. And so many literalist leaders seemed adept at fitting their faith to their personal self-interest. Fundamentalist figures in the U.S., for example, don't actually turn the other cheek, do they? Or love their enemies, do they? Or give all their money to the poor, do they? They build big evangelical organizations with themselves at the top. I think of Joel Osteen. He might have a nice message sometime, a beautiful message, a nice smile, a happy person, but I'd be happy too if I was raking in the kind of money he was. You know, money doesn't buy happiness, but the lack of money sure buys a lot of unhappiness. So, yeah, you could have a lot more fun with $1 billion than you could with 12. I'm just saying. So, I look at guys like that. And if you like Joel Osteen, that's okay. I don't care. But you look at him. He's built a huge organization where he's at the top. They preach morality. They approve those who bomb abortion clinics and wage war. Well, not always necessarily. I don't think there's anybody that approves bombing. But there are places like the Westboro Baptist Church that does. I don't know if they even... I don't even know even if they... So maybe I'm overspeaking that. Maybe it's not about approving bombing, but it's about approving protestation, about approving the belittlement of people who think differently than you do. It's about protesting people. It's about showing up at a soldier's funeral to protest. That to me is wrong stuff. They're exactly the sorts of hypocrites that Jesus condemns in the Gospels. And the irony is that most extreme fundamentalists are actually only one small step from waking up. They're already completely convinced that everyone else's religion is utter nonsense. All they need to do now is realize that so is their own. But for fundamentalists, this step is a giant leap into the unknown, requiring a genuine faith in the mystery of existence, which they have yet to find. And fundamentalists need to be certain that they know the truth. And you know how I know this? Because I was a fundamentalist. I was in a conservative fundamentalist school, and I was a conservative fundamentalist. Evangelical conservative fundamentalist. So fundamentalists need to be certain they know the truth, because the only alternative they see is terrifying. Fundamentalists are us at our most lost. As the Christian Gnostic Theodotus put it in different letters. Theodotus put it many centuries ago, those who are the most asleep think they are the most awake, being under the power of vivid and fixed visions, so that those who are most ignorant think they know the most. Yet it's often because they have this genuine experience of awaking from the illusion of separateness that people embrace fundamentalism. Make no mistake about it, at fundamentalist meetings, people experience something very special. They feel roused from the everyday numbness that we call normality, and they begin to feel alive again. They're having transpersonal experiences. But then so were the people at the Nazi Nuremberg rallies. They also transcended their sense of being an isolated individual, but unfortunately became caught up in the greater limited identity of being German. And in the same way, religious fundamentalists experience the relief of transcending their personal identity, but becoming embroiled in the larger limited identity of being a Christian, a Muslim, or whatever. Many forward-thinking people are depressed by the rise of modern fundamentalism, which threatens to take us back to the Dark Ages. And if you look at Christian fundamentalism, there is a fine line that separates it from Muslim fundamentalism. Extremist fundamentalism is what I'm talking about. This stuff takes us back to the Dark Ages when religion ruled the world with an iron fist. But fundamentalism is not to be feared because it's nothing new. What's new is that so many of us now no longer see such bigotry as acceptable. I didn't see it that way 40 years ago when I started backing away from it. And by the way, what took me so long to back out of fundamentalism was the fact that I believed in the literal history of Jesus. And I believed that fundamentalism and Christianity were inextricably linked. And that if I denied this one portion or backed away from that thinking, I was somehow backsliding or was out of favor with God, or I wasn't really a Christian at all, as some would have told me. So what has changed is throughout large parts of the Western world, especially Europe, new ways of thinking have steadily eroded the totalitarian regime that was Christendom. This has resulted in the demise of organized religion that we're seeing and we're sensing. It's not that, as fundamentalism would tell you, that human hearts have grown further from God. I don't think that's true at all. I think they've grown further from the concept of literalist history of religion. Of fundamentalism. This has resulted in the demise of organized religion. But it's also revealed the last, if you will, the last rump of believers who are desperately holding on to a medieval worldview whose day has long gone. And you have to ask, does that mean the teachings are wrong just because the practice was wrong? Well, we're going to get into that. We're going to look at that some more. It's only because the new ways of looking at the world have become so popular that we felt the need to give a name to the old way of seeing things and call it fundamentalism, traditionalism. But creating a new name creates the erroneous impression that this was a christening when in fact it was more like a funeral. Fundamentalism is not proof of the power of religious literalism, but it's rather its weakness. Fundamentalism is religious literalism in the throes of death. It's not the first flush of youth. Fundamentalists are fighting this defensive rearguard battle against the modern world because they know that they are losing the war of ideas. And the moment a set of beliefs is thought of as a tradition that needs saving, it's already doomed. So, think of it this way. When President George W. Bush responded to the tragedy of 9/11, he used biblical language to declare, you are either with us or you're against us. Now, he has that right to say things that way. He has his right to his beliefs, but not in the way that he intended. The choice we face right now is to be with George Bush or Osama bin Laden and all those religious literalists who choose to perpetrate division through violence and hatred, or to wake up to oneness and choose love and forgiveness, as the Gnostics have taught for centuries. So I think George Bush was off when he used that comment, although we get the idea he was trying to get across. Are we for George? Are we for Osama? Or are we against them? How we make this choice is going to define the world we co-create in this new millennia, which we're now, almost 20 years into. Do you realize 9/11 was almost 20 years ago? 19 years ago. Wow. And I remember it like it was yesterday. So, here's the heretical heritage that we have. Throughout history, Gnostics have presented the possibility of awakening to gnosis, to knowledge, as an alternative to religious literalism. Gnostics are always outspoken critics of the outdated status quo, which forever gets them into trouble. They're branded heretics. They're persecuted horribly. But through their courage, the spiritual heart of religion has kept beating through the ages. The great scientist and freethinker Albert Einstein said, "The religious geniuses of all ages have been distinguished by the kind of religious feeling which knows no dogma and no God conceived in man's image." See, even Einstein talked about God. He went on, he said, "so that there can be no church whose central teachings are based on it. Hence, it is precisely among the heretics of every age that we find men who were filled with this highest kind of religious feeling and were in many cases regarded by their contemporaries as atheists, sometimes also as saints. Looked at in this light, men like Democritus, Francis of Assisi, and Spinoza are closely akin to one another." This is what Einstein had to say. So, Gnostics come from all sorts of different backgrounds, but form one tradition of awakening. In the West, this tradition has been called by many names, such as Pythagoreanism, Platonism, mysticism, esotericism, perennial philosophy, and a bewildering number of other things. We call this tradition Gnosticism because it teaches the philosophy which leads to gnosis, or to waking up, which we talked about yesterday. The different individuals who make up this tradition didn't use all these names, of course, but grouping them together as Gnostics, in this broad sense in which we use the word, enables us to treat this important movement in the evolution of ideas as one with an identifiable tradition. Literalists teach blind adherence to their religion, but Gnostics are eclectics who seek out wisdom wherever it can be found. They emphasize that only by thinking in new ways will we become more conscious. And it's no surprise, therefore, that in those periods of history in which literalist religion has dominated, we've been consumed by violence or simply stagnated. But for those brief moments when Gnosticism has flourished, we've enjoyed a flowing of culture and wisdom. That's a generality, but this is what happened in history. History repeats itself, albeit with subtle twists at every turn. One pattern discernible in the chaotic unfolding events is that there are periods where and when humanity seems to wake up. Like a bright child, we start asking some interesting questions. And as in childhood, these intense bursts of inquiry are often accompanied by explosions of creativity. And at such times, anything seems possible, and there appears to be absolutely no limits to the human imagination. The result is usually a spectacular blossoming of culture. And this should be no surprise, because what's culture but the measure of humanity's imagination? Sadly, these eruptions of awakening are followed by long periods when humanity succumbs to the totalitarian grip of dogmatism and orthodoxy. Culture declines and usually goes into reverse under these conditions. There's so much talk about tradition and going back to the basics. Few original works are created as the climate is simply too dangerous for them to appear. Culture becomes merely the repetition of forms, of expressions declared safe by the monarch, or the mullahs, or the moral majority, or the religious right. And although the average citizen doesn't have a clue as to what's really going on around them because they just don't pay attention, it's shouted loudly from every synagogue, church, or mosque that somebody somewhere is absolutely certain. They have the ear of the Almighty. God's listening to me. They have all the answers in their big black books. Consequently, no one else needs to worry about their heads about all these things or any of these things. In fact, it's better if they don't worry or even think about these things at all. And so, with nothing to think about, everybody slowly nods off because the organization's going to tell you how to live. That's until another meddling Gnostic philosopher pops up with childish questions such as, where do we come from? Is there a God? Why is the emperor naked? And thank goodness they do. There has to be someone to stand up to all those know-it-alls shouting about into their megaphones of spirituality that this is how it is and this is how it's supposed to be done. This is who you are and this is who you were supposed to be. This is what you should be doing. And what have we found as a result of this? What's remarkable is that there have been so many prepared to take the appalling risks of confronting the men with the megaphones. And we should be eternally grateful to them because they have sowed the seeds of all that is the best about human culture. You can look through history at different periods of these upbursts, these upheavals. You can look at it by city. Look at Athens. One of the great explosions of culture happened in classical Athens. For a brief moment in the middle of the 5th century BCE, there was an outburst of free inquiry during which philosophers, attacked the religion of Greece, ridiculed the literalist interpretation of the works of Homer and Hesiod, which was the Greeks' Bible, pretty much. Socrates and Plato taught the perennial Gnostic philosophy that all is one, and they lambasted Homer and Hesiod. They accused them of attributing to the gods everything that is a shame and reproach among men, stealing and committing adultery and deceiving each other. And the Greeks were now thinking in startlingly new ways about the gods, creation, and what it was to be human. The old ideas couldn't contain the outpouring of intellectual energy, and they broke apart. But look at the new ideas that were created: democracy, philosophy, science, education, literature, theater, mathematics, architecture, sculpture, music, sport. The list goes on and on and on and on. The accomplishments of the Greeks were just basically awe-inspiring, and their civilization formed the blueprint for our modern world. This vibrant, questioning culture produced incredible wonders, and then utterly collapsed when it succumbed to religious dogma and dogmatism. So at the end of the 5th century, the ousted oligarchs resumed power. They initiated reactionary backlash, and tragically but typically the principal victims were the very people who had inspired the cultural renaissance in the first place. The brilliant and eccentric philosopher Anaxagoras, advisor of the great leader of classical Athens, Pericles, was indicted for heresy. He was sent into exile. Xenophanes was indicted for impiety and banished from Athens. His crime? Expressing blasphemous sentiments such as, if cattle and horses had hands, would they draw the forms of their gods like cattle and horses? How heretical is that? And no one knows or will ever know the truth about the gods, for even if you did stumble on the truth, you would not know you had. He was banished for that. Protagoras, the philosopher who famously made man the measure of all things, was indicted for heresy. His book was burnt in the street, and he drowned whilst trying to escape his persecutors. Socrates, the most celebrated philosopher of them all, was condemned and executed. These are just some of the famous victims of the intellectual purge that were carried out by the 30 tyrants who now ruled Athens. Another 1,500 free thinkers and philosophers also perished in the Reign of Terror. Athens had successfully cut off her own head. It was a horrible scenario, but one that history would repeat time and time and time again. We got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to keep going. Another city to look at in the ancient past where Gnosticism had its great rise was Alexandria. Talked about Hypatia of Alexandria not long ago, a couple days ago. The Athens experiment was ruthlessly crushed, but Gnosticism lived to inspire another great renaissance of wisdom and culture in Hellenic Alexandria from the 3rd century BCE. Here, the spiritual wisdom of the world met and was synthesized into dynamic forms by eclectic Gnosticism. They merged Greek and Egyptian philosophy to create the Hermetica. Greek, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian influences flowed together to create the Chaldean oracles. Greek philosophy syncretized with Jewish mythology to create Christianity. Alchemy, Buddhism, and every other spiritual tradition, even through to Zoroastrianism, were openly practiced and discussed in Alexandria. The great library of Alexandria was said to contain almost 500,000 scrolls, including works by writers such as Euclid, Archimedes, and Ptolemy, who all worked at the library at one time or another. It also contained the books of Aristarchus of Samos, who demonstrated that the Earth is one of the planets and orbits the sun rather than being the center of the galaxy or the solar system where the sun orbited it. And Eratosthenes, who calculated the obliquity of the ecliptic and the diameter of the earth with an error of less than 1%. Hipparchus, who determined the precession of the equinoxes and the size of the sun and calculated lunar eclipses, and Apollonius, who produced a study of conic sections 1400 years before Kepler rediscovered this vital tool for calculating the orbits of the planets. These things all thrived in ancient Alexandria under Gnosticism. The scientist Carl Sagan argued that if human progress had not been interrupted by the Dark Ages, the medieval period of cathedral building might instead have witnessed the beginning of the space age. But this didn't happen. When literalist Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, the world went mad again. Free inquiry was officially terminated, and the great library was put to the torch by rampaging bands of black-robed monks. Augustine constructed the first ever legal argument that the state had the right and the duty to enforce religious orthodoxy on its subjects. Augustine's opponents denounced the unholy alliance between Catholics and the Roman state, but they could now be legally suppressed with violence, if necessary. And I can go on. We're at the end of the show here, folks. So I go on and I look at Baghdad and what happened in Baghdad under Gnosticism. You can look at Florence, what happened in Florence under Gnosticism. You can look at all of these things that led to this great Gnostic Renaissance. And I want you to know that right now, today, we're in the middle of a new Gnostic Renaissance. And we'll talk about that tomorrow when we come back. Not tomorrow, Monday. I'll see you all on Sunday morning for my live stream. It's not part of the radio show at Odyssey, but it's my live stream. It's Sunday. And we'll do some tarot readings and talk and do all kinds of other stuff. So see you there. Thanks for listening tonight. Have a great weekend. See you on Monday.